Good evening. I am here to provide an update on the budget for the board. We just did a update 3 weeks ago, so some of this may feel somewhat iterative from that or just a regurgitation of that. I've tried to change it up a little bit to indicate where things have changed and where we still have some question. But before we do this, and I've never done this before, so bear with me, we do have a video that I'd like to share.
Hey PSD, ever wonder how your schools get money and what they spend it on? Let's take a look. In Colorado, schools are funded from two primary sources: the state funding formula, which is determined by the state legislature every year, and local revenue, which includes mill levy overrides, property taxes, and vehicle registrations. In the year 2000, Colorado voters said they wanted education funding to increase every year with inflation. But during the recession, the legislature couldn't fund those increases. So beginning in 2009, they applied what's called the negative factor to the state funding formula, giving the state legislature the ability to reduce school funding to balance the state budget. This practice is still in place and means K-12 education gets less money than would otherwise be provided under the Colorado Constitution. For PSD, this is $26 million less in revenue every year. So the money from our two funding sources is what makes up our general fund and is distributed as follows. 100% of every dollar PSD receives goes to supporting students. 50 cents of every dollar is given directly to the schools in the form of student-based budgeting. Schools receive an allocation for every student enrolled at their school. The principal, in collaboration with staff and parents, decides how to use this money to pay for teachers, classified staff, supplies, and more. 35 cents of every dollar supports essential school-based services, including principals and assistant principals and other school operations. That means that 85 cents of every dollar goes directly to the schools to support students. 13 cents of every dollar funds central services, including departments like finance, HR, maintenance, professional development, and many more. And 2 cents of every dollar supports central administration. So to recap, the district receives money from the state for every student. This, coupled with money from property taxes and mill levy overrides, is allocated directly to our schools to support students. For more information, visit www.psdschools.org/knowthebudget.
You don't need to applaud for me. This was all Channel 10, and they're great work. So yes, they are awesome. Isn't that an awesome video? So it's quick, it's to the point, and we're trying to educate folks as to what's going on. So it's probably the first part of a much larger communication campaign around the budget. But I wanted to share that with the board because I really liked the video. And in fact, our budget director, as I'm getting this ready here, our budget director was just floored. He comes from a smaller district, and he was like, that is just fabulous. He was amazed by it. So without further ado, we'll get into the budget update. I will move quickly through some of the slides that are redundant from the last time, and then I'll slow down on some other ones. Key three areas still, this slide really hasn't changed, except we will be reviewing not only the state budget challenges, but I also want to incorporate conceptually the conversation of hitting the base that's been stirring not only in our district, but in other districts and across the state. So I'm going to conceptually talk about that, and hopefully you understand kind of what's happening, what's coming. We'll talk about our plan for restoration of reserves. So this has moved beyond just options for restoration of reserves. We have a plan put together, so we'll review that again, and I don't think it's changed greatly since 3 weeks ago. So. And then last, we'll go through updated budget assumptions, and we'll put those all together to determine how we're getting ready to deliver a preliminary budget in the next board meeting. So the first one, again, this is somewhat redundant, so I'll move through it quickly. We had two forecasts at the state, and both were representing that there was a large gap in the state's funding of about $700 million is what the Joint Budget Committee had penciled in that they needed to solve for. And K-12 was about $370 million of that $700 million gap. So big portion of the gap that the state was dealing with. Again, we went through this in more detail last time, so I'm moving through it quickly. To address this gap, the state is proposing multiple things. One, and probably the largest reduction before K-12, is reductions to Colorado hospitals. So the Joint Budget Committee has put together a plan to to help address this gap, but it will mean reductions to Colorado hospitals. Obviously, we're K-12. We're more interested in the second bullet point, what's going on with K-12 and for schools. In this budget plan, they are planning on increasing the negative factor by 51 million. I've heard 48 million today. It's around 50 million is what we're talking about. We have not seen a run, meaning district by district, that determines exactly what this looks like. We do have a run from November that indicates what a $50 million increase would look like back then, and right then it was about $55 per student. So that gives some context as to how much that negative factor increase is potentially going to weigh on the budget once we see the final details. There is some proposed legislative decreases to statutory reserves to help them bring the budget into balance, and they've also done a lot of moving between different budgets and cash funds, carryover funds, whatever you want to call them, to help shore up other programs and to align resources for the priorities outlined in this new budget. So that was pretty much a summary of everything that we had talked about up to the last meeting. Now I want to talk more about this concept of hitting the base. And I believe everybody's at least at some level understanding what this is, whether you've heard it from me or you've heard it at a state meeting or whatever the case. We've had some folks that have put together some modeling, and it's gaining a lot of traction as being very reliable modeling. And so I have not done this modeling, but I want to go through what the modeling is showing. The first thing is, before we even look at it, we have to ground ourselves in some of the assumptions in this model, because all of these will change through time. So to look at this model and say that it's going to accurately predict where we're going to be in 4 years is not a good way to look at this. But what it really does is it kind of tells us what is the path that we may be on. And I really like the analogy that was mentioned to me by a board member earlier about a hurricane path, because I think it really is kind of what we're talking about here. Is we've identified that there's a storm brewing out in let me get my oceans correct, Atlantic, and we can see this. You know, you can see it on the radar, and so this is where we're at. We see the storm coming. Now, there's a lot of different paths that this storm can take, and it depends on what the legislature does. It depends on what we might do at the ballot box. It depends on how we might balance the budget and how we make our priorities at the state level. But really what this is doing is it's saying we see the storm coming. We don't know exactly where it's going to land, but we need to prepare for it. And so I think it's a good analogy, and I really like the visual image of just seeing a storm out in the Atlantic. And we've all seen that, where the radar picture shows it could go this way, it could go that way. Well, that's what we're trying to figure out right now, is where is this going to hit? Okay. So when we look at the modeling and when we think about that conceptually, just think about that hurricane forecast, we have to understand what the rules are behind the modeling. The first one is that they're assuming that inflation will grow at 2.5% each year. This is important because this is where the base increases annually, and 2.5% is in my estimate, is a good assumption. Now, is it going to be 2.5 every year? No, 1 year it's going to be 3, another year might be 2, but on average it's about 2.5% moving forward. Another big one, and I put an asterisk behind this because I think it is something we need to be aware of in the modeling. The modeling itself makes a very broad assumption that per pupil amounts will not increase in future years. Now, that's already been potentially proven wrong with this year's action, so we'd have to update that modeling to reflect it. It doesn't change the outcome of whether the storm's going to materialize or not. It just changes the trajectory. It may be that it's delayed another year because the legislature took some action and actually provided some inflationary increase this year, minus the 50 million negative factor increase. It's important for us to just understand that that's how this modeling is doing, and I don't believe that that's going to be exactly what happens from year to year. But the modeling does predict that there's a point where the state can no longer fund the formula. So we'll look at that a little closer in another graphic, I think. Another assumption the modeling's making, and this is a calculation, it's not really an assumption, but there's approximately $900 million of factors left for the state to cut before they hit base funding purely. So that's another key piece of this modeling. And then just for awareness, not that it's an assumption in the model, but if we were to look at this current day right now, how far is PSD above the base? We're about $600 per kid. And so we are closer to the base than many districts, but we still have a little bit ways to fall before we get to the base. So this may not seem like it's making a whole lot of sense. Hopefully these graphics will improve upon what I'm setting up here. Again, we need to understand the assumptions, because I think you can poke holes in some of these assumptions, or you can say that's not exactly the way I'd think about it. That's fine. I think we can run various different variants of the model and see that the outcome really doesn't change a whole lot. It just may delay the outcome. Again, I'm going to reiterate this. All of this can change, whether it be through legislative action, constitutional changes, changes to the budget priority. Any of it's all up in the air. So instead of giving you a bunch of numbers, because that did not seem like it was working well as I was talking about it, what I decided to do was put together a graphic that I think encapsulates the concepts of what we're talking about here. So one of the first things is distinguishing between what we call base funding and factor funding. What this graphic displays is each district, line by line, from lowest PPR, per pupil revenue, to highest per pupil revenue. And what it does is it distinguishes between how much of that is guaranteed base funding versus how much of that is factors, okay? So you look at this chart, and it actually had me scratching my head for a few minutes, and that's why I added another bullet point in here, is this chart is almost a little bit misleading if you don't think about what it's saying. All this is saying, this is the per pupil amounts per kid, but without this other arrow, I think you lose a lot of context on this graphic. What I did is I just looked and I summed up half of the way through the districts, lowest end to the top end, or to the middle, and in that line where that vertical line is there, and the arrow that says 96% of all students onto the side, that's where the majority of the students are. So to look at this graphic and say this is a distribution of the revenue is not a good way to look at this. What this is a distribution of the per pupil amounts each district's getting, but recognize those districts on the extreme right of this graphic are going to be those extremely small districts. So in magnitude of revenue or budget, they're not as big. This is an important concept because it's what makes all the districts hit the base so quickly. Okay, so what are we talking about here? Conceptually, this is pretty easy. The state has limited revenue and limited resources, and we see this time and time again, year after year. The negative factor is either increasing or staying static. We know that there's limited resources from the state and that they're going to be needing to be pushing down on what's available. At the same time, our base in the formula is increasing by inflation annually. So if you think about those two dynamics, what happens over time is the base grows with inflation. But because the state does not have enough to keep up with that, what they're having to do is they're going to have to start chipping away at the red bars, and in this place you can see that this would be at these smaller districts, and this is not meant to be drawn to scale or anything. It's just drawn for conceptual knowledge only. What this is going to show is that we're going to have to start chipping away at that pink area or the red area to continue to fund the blue area, and at some point those two pinch together and the blue is what you're left with. Okay? Now, why I wanted to mention this 96% arrow is to look at this graphic and say, wow, we've got a lot of factors to still cut through is a little bit erroneous, because you have to multiply it by the number of kids in each district. When you do that, the revenue picture on the left side is enormous compared to what's on the right side. So when the left side starts lifting or the base starts growing, the factors disappear extremely quick because they're targeted to a smaller piece of the revenue. Does that make sense to folks? Because that's conceptually very important. And honestly, it had me scratching my head for a little bit because I was looking at this graphic the wrong way when I first put it together and said, okay, well, if we're increasing the base, then we should be able to carve this pink portion of the red off and fit it under there. That's not right, because 96% of the revenue is flowing in the lower half of this graphic. Okay. So looking at those graphics and thinking of those conceptually, and again, I promise that we're not going to go through all the numbers tonight, but I want to go through some of the big ideas of this analysis, of which will be further fine-tuned. And again, I'm underlining this is given the assumptions I outlined before. The first one is Poudre School District could be one of the first districts to hit the base. This, I alluded to this at the last board meeting. We're a floor-funded district, meaning we already get the lowest per pupil revenue possible in the school finance formula. So it makes sense that we would be one of the first districts to hit the base. And according to this modeling, it could happen in 1920. Again, understand this is the graphic of the hurricane path, and these years could ebb and flow depending on what happens at the state capitol and then the state constitution, if anything there. So PSD could be funded at the base. I think I'm just reiterating that there. From fiscal year 1920 to 21-22, the state will need to reduce districts above the base to lift those that are below. So that was that graphic that I was trying to describe in a visual. At this point, the analysis would indicate that the formula is broken and can no longer support the formula that we have. Okay? When we look at the modeling and we look at 21-22, it indicates that at that point, given the assumptions, I'm going to really highlight that, given those assumptions, that because the lift is so great and there's not enough left in that right hand of the graphic, that there's a point where all 178 districts hit the base almost at once. And so that you can see that happens pretty quickly from that fiscal year 20 year to the fiscal year 22 year. So it doesn't take long for that to happen. The first year, there's only 14 districts. Within the course of 3 years, we're seeing all 178 districts drop to the base, okay, given the assumptions that are outlined. So that is hitting the base, and I wanted to spend a little time with that with the board, not only just to try to drive the concepts home, but also to share with our community what's on the forecast and what we're looking at and why we're talking about this, because this is something we need to prepare for many years in advance. And we need to be very thoughtful about how we do that. So I wanted to spend some time as to why we're talking about budget concerns going forward beyond just the budget year next year. Again, this slide hasn't changed at all. So we have not introduced a School Finance Act yet. Heard from folks today that may be coming early next week, of which we will be excited to see. We're also not anticipating any major changes from what the Joint Budget Committee put together to what the School Finance Act may materialize as, but I cannot stand at the podium and guarantee that. Obviously, the legislatures will do what they will do, but that's what we're hearing, is not to expect many changes from when that act is introduced, so that's good news. Federal funds, I actually put this slide together with John McKay earlier today, and so I'm glad that he was actually had the opportunity to come up and talk a little bit more in detail than what I would do. Let's not lose sight of the fact that federal funds are also taking reductions from the federal level. John put together some bullets for me, so I'm not going to go through this whole slide. Basically, John did a good job of summarizing already. We're making adjustments where we can. We're trying to keep programming where it is for schools, but we are having to make some adjustments because of the reduction in federal funds that is happening externally, not due to internal budget decisions. We have not received our allocations yet for our federal funds. Usually we do receive those in early April. We're hearing that will be, John said, early to mid-May. I heard mid-May. So we have actually put some contingency plans with our title schools to understand that there might be a range of where that staffing is. We've actually been, Assistant Soups and I have been busy, and will be busy for the next 2 days, meeting with every school in the district to review their budget plan for next year. And those schools that are impacted have been informed and are prepared and understand what's coming, at least for next year, title for the federal funds. Restoration of PSD reserves, exact same slide as last time, have not changed it. We have a fund balance policy that is calling for anywhere from 3 to 5%, of which is $7.5 million to $12.5 million. I had indicated last time that we shouldn't target the low range, we should target maybe more mid-range, of which I am pleased to say that we have a plan together to to bring reserves back into an acceptable level. The first one, we'll just walk through this again briefly because we've already looked at this to some extent before. We are projecting, without any action, to end the fiscal year with $600,000 in reserves. We talked a lot about that. We have identified and swept $4.3 million from school and department carryovers. About $700,000 of that came from schools, and about $3.6 million came from central departments. This was not a sweep of all carryover. We did not sweep any carryover below 10% of the school or department's annual budget allocation of 10% or less. I don't know if I said that right. Sounds like I said a lot of words there. So we did not sweep anything under 10% for those schools that had carryover underneath that. We're talking about carryovers in excess of 10%, which got us this $4.3 million. We've also talked about reducing the Board of Education contingency reserves, very similar to what schools and departments are doing. Not exactly the same thing for the board, but along the common thread, reducing that contingency reserve, and also retaining and not spending the mill levy override from next year. These are high-level concepts here. As we were talking in detail about this, I don't want to lose sight of the fact that we won't retain all $2.6 million of the revenue here. We do need to allocate some to the charter schools on a pro rata basis, so that would be roughly about 93% of that 2.6 is what that number really will be materialize as. But long story short, we're under $10 million above where I was hoping to be at a minimum of 9. So I'm pretty pleased with where we're at. And I believe we've done good work on this. Hard work, but good work. Let's go through the budget assumptions quickly. None of these have changed from the last time. So still factoring in 2.8% inflation. We are factoring in student growth of 0.34%. So much more compressed than our traditional 1.5% that we've been growing traditionally. I'm still using, I alluded to this earlier, I'm still using old numbers and stale numbers in these. I'm pretty confident in them, but just give me a little leeway when the School Finance Act does hit that there may be some minor adjustments as we get the real print on paper as to what's going to happen. But I think we're in the ballpark. We're projecting that the change with the negative factor increase could be yielding about $5.8 million more to spend next year in next year's budget. We are also factoring in retirement differential of $1.4 million, very similar to last year, and we're seeing the same trend for the retirement paper coming in this year. We will continue to feel cost pressures, so we do have some growth, even at a compressed growth rate. We also have para that is increasing annually according to statute. This is the last statutory increase that we need to plan for, unless there's other future ones on the horizon, of which is possible. And then we get into our negotiated cost drivers. So right now we're looking at health and dental increases of 5%. That's roughly just about $700,000 for the employer. Employees that have a spouse or children covered under the plan would also have to pay some additional increase on that also. Also contemplated or being discussed are lane changes for licensed employees. That's an increase for the amount of education they have, and an equivalent provided to ACE and PACE for market adjustments. A step cost is also being considered at $3.8 million. This is a reflection of increase for the years of service that an employee on the license schedule would have, and an equivalent dollar amount to ACE and PACE would be provided to move people through their ranges because their salary schedules are structured differently. And then just to note, any cost of living adjustment for every 1% we add, there's about $1.6 million in cost for that COLA. We've also targeted, since we've last talked 3 weeks ago, we've also targeted $800,000 of ongoing reductions to help really 2 things. 1, to help balance the budget next year, and 2, to help restore district unassigned reserves. So that's kind of a twofold piece there, and Cabinet has been reviewing a reduction plan, and we were making some minor adjustments, and we'll communicate that plan out when we're ready, and when it's finalized. We're not quite there yet. Okay. So let's put this all together. This is something I didn't do in the last presentation, is when we take the revenue, add in our retirement differential, I'm going to call it revenue. I think it's clearer this way. It's an offset to expense. and the ongoing reductions, we're targeting increases of about $8 million. We have the pieces that have already been allocated out for student-based budgeting. For para, we need to set that aside. And then we really get into some of the negotiated items, so the health, license, lane change, STEP. And in this scenario, we would do the 5% for health, license, lane changes, and equivalents for ACE and PACE, and the STEP equivalent, or STEP and the equivalent for ACE and PACE. In this scenario, if we did all that, that would leave us $1.33 million left unspent after all of that is done. Okay, so where we're at in negotiations, and without kind of giving up all the work that we've done quite yet, we're really talking about options that may fit within that 1.33 at the bottom and split up between a COLA and reserve restoration or some combination thereof. Okay. So it wouldn't be one or the other necessarily. I think we're really approaching this collaboratively and understanding there probably needs to be some COLA increase, although we may want to wait to understand what exactly where our budget comes in at. We had a very unexpected decrease in enrollment this year that caught us all off guard. And so we're even talking about contingency language that would delay that decision maybe until after we know that for sure. So those are some of the concepts we're kicking around in negotiations. Negotiations, the larger circle did task a smaller group to do some what they call straw design work, and so we are doing that work. In fact, we're meeting tomorrow night to further discuss those straw designs that have been developed. But that's really where I think the budget's landing, at least at this point. And so I believe we're on track for getting a budget ready for 17-18. What we need to be prepared for is that, again, that hurricane plot on what's going to happen in the future. Always want to emphasize our focus areas within the budget. I read these last time, so I won't read them again. And then finally, budget process timeline. It's always good to introduce the budget process timeline. Since we've last met, the Budget Advisory Committee has met once. We've also met with tactical leadership and others at least twice, I believe now. So we're in process of doing some of those meetings, and now that we're actually gathering some information to take to them, that the meetings are actually getting pretty exciting. So, and then a budget timeline. We're in the April-May zone, so hopefully we can finalize negotiations and get a School Finance Act introduced and finalized. So those are the big points or the big hurdles in front of us, at least for next budget cycle. And then I can take questions at this point.
Rob.
So I have a couple questions.
Yes, sir.
One of them is, for your hitting the base slides, is the assumption that school funding is self-contained? Meaning, the way you described it, you know, we have to take things out of the factors to make the base go up, right? And I don't know what the legalities of this are, and I'm sure the politics are very difficult, but if, for example, they found money somewhere else in the budget to throw into the base, that's not thought about in these slides this way, right?
That is not an assumption. One of the assumptions is that it's a
zero-sum game on this.
Yeah, but I don't know that the model itself is making that assumption. I think we're making that assumption broad, or the people that have put this together, broader, the fact that we see the trend of not getting increases to K-12 time and time again. So I think you're, I'm not discounting what you said.
No,
I think you're right. I think there's.
So is there not any assumption that state revenue is going to go up by economic growth to provide, and that some percentage of that revenue is going to flow to education as opposed to,
that's my understanding as I look at this scenario. And again, I think that as we begin our strategic planning, I may take some concepts from this, but I may want to modify and improve it. And I would imagine all the districts will be participating in that.
No, I understand.
But it's good to understand the assumptions and what's in here and what's not, because you can quickly go down the wrong road if you think there's assumptions in there that really aren't.
Okay. I appreciate the clarification, and I certainly understand and accept the fact that some of what I just talked about may change the timing of when some of this stuff happens, but we're heading on this trajectory, and it's not that far out, whether it's 2019 or 2021 or whatever. We're going to, in our in the lifetime, let me put it this way, in the lifetime of some of our kids who are currently in kindergarten, we're going to be at the base unless something changes
Yeah.
with regard to the way the state handles its finances.
Yeah, and I think the example you brought up is a really good one, and I actually mentioned it when I was doing the presentation, that already the analysis in this work needs to be updated because the state did exactly what you described. They cut hospitals to put more money to K-12. So
Yeah.
that's not reflected in any of the numbers that are generating this
Sure.
modeling or the graphics I've got up here. But those are things that we need to factor in, and those are options available to the legislature to
Up
do
to a
that.
point, right?
Up to a point.
Then there are some obligations that we have that are not
Absolutely.
tenable, well, are either not legal because of federal entanglements, if you want to call it that, or are not tenable, like, I don't know, shutting down the prison system or something, you know, or
Correct.
the judicial system. I mean, that's not going to happen.
There's only so much
Yeah,
that you
there's
can
only
do
so
in the
much
state's
flexibility.
budget.
So I get it. Okay. So the other thing that I wanted to just emphasize, and it's on your slides, but I don't think you mentioned it, is this possibility of Senate Bill 1761.
Oh,
which
yeah,
is,
I did gloss over that.
Yeah, which is you know, it sounds, you know, depending on where you sit, it sounds like a swell idea, but the net effect of this could be, if it passes, that we're going to get hit, that the district schools are going to have to take $1.5 million out of each year out of our budget and transfer that to the charter schools, which I suppose is a swell thing for the charter schools, but it has, I mean, if you go back to the other slide that says we only have $1.33 million left over
Yeah,
after all those things, we'd have minus $200,000 left over
if
if
it were,
we had to do that this year.
if it all came in at once, yes.
And oh, by
absolutely.
the way, that last slide, that last bullet, I think, is also important, where it talks about any new charter schools would cause further future diversions of existing allocations, which means that if we approved a charter school for next year or for the year after, right, that would add to the total of money that we need to give away from the existing. We don't get any additional revenue for that. We take our existing revenue and we take some more out of it and we hand it to the new charter school. And again, I understand theoretically the appeal of that, but when we have a zero-sum set of finances to be working with that's declining, it's very scary from the school district point of view.
And not to interrupt your train of thought, but something else that doesn't contemplate, a lot of people don't understand that there are two different categories of charter schools. There are charter schools
yeah,
that are
right.
chartered by the district, and there are charter schools that are chartered through the state for whatever reason. And we have 3 of those schools here in our district, and basically what Senate Bill 61 would say is that the state would go ahead and take money out of its general fund to put the equivalent of what it would get if it were a district charter school into the budget. So basically, you would be responsible in your taxes for paying for whatever some other local district had decided to give to its charter schools in its mill levy override. So basically, it's taken away total local accountability and total local control because of this. And it would decrease the overall size of the general fund, which is what gives money to our schools, and so it further drives down the total amount of money available to all the schools and makes that base hitting the base a lot faster than it would otherwise be.
Right.
Just, I don't want to forget that point, because we have at least 3 of those charter schools right now. We have no control over if they are in our district or not, because that is not a decision that districts are given any control over.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I do want to emphasize, as you do on your slide, that we already provide mill levy funding as per our agreements with charter schools, district charter schools, that were in existence at the time, generally, that were in existence at the time the mill levy passed. So we try to basically what that allows us to do, frankly speaking, is to account for the funds in our mill levy calculations. And this, if it passed, would basically cause us to have an expenditure that we did not expect, a significant expenditure that we had no reason to expect. And so,
And going down that line of thought, you made me think of something I hadn't thought of before, is that, take our 2010 mill levy, for example, although that one's one we are splitting, but let's assume we weren't. We've got static budgets that define choice and innovation grants, tech refresh, all of these things that we're doing, and what this Senate bill could do if we weren't allocating those on a pro rata basis, it could require it, and it would require us to go in and adjust those budgets down to say, okay, now instead of getting $300,000 in choice and innovation grants, you're getting 200 and some thousand. It's going to be some reduced amount because we're having to provide more money to the charter schools from a finite pot of revenue from our mill levy override. I believe that, I mean, obviously this bill has not passed yet. It's actually been delayed because they want to work on the budget in the School Finance Act first, but this is a big piece, and the reason why it's on my slide. You know, if this ends up happening, I would imagine, it may not be our district, but I would imagine there's going to be some district out there that'll challenge this in the courts to say, how can you change what the voters had originally authorized, and we'll have to see how that goes.
Dr. Smyser.
In the legislation, does it specify or contemplate how to make sure that the charters who are going to use that money follow the intent of the ballot measure? Because the ballot measure says what we can spend it on, and we track that.
I was trying to re-envision the bill in my head, and I don't believe it does unless somebody has knowledge.
Actually, well, yes, it does. You have to. So, for instance, if you had said, we're going to, in your ballot language, you were going to spend the mill levy override money, let's say, on all-day kindergarten funding, then, yeah, you would have to spend it that way. I mean, you would still, if you had charter school kids in kindergarten, you would have to share that with them. But or if there were a program that they didn't have, my understanding was that it wouldn't have to go that way.
Okay, because perhaps they don't want to do that, whatever that thing is.
And so I think the devil's going to be in the details in this one, and how it gets put into practice.
Nate.
I think Dr. Smyser was just stating one of the arguments that might be made in a lawsuit, because I don't think the bill is specific enough to resolve that question.
Yeah, so we'll wait and see. Obviously, from a budget standpoint, we prefer that this bill does not pass this year, because it does create more hardship that we've got on the horizon too. So, and it's at a time where we're already dwindling our revenue down, and to dwindle it further just doesn't make a lot of sense to me right now.